I want to have a conversation about normalizing, which is obviously a form of annealing, and there's an anomaly that occurs that in heating up your steel, this is really, it's only a blacksmithing issue, but during heating up your steel, you have a point that once you have reached critical temperature, which on each steel is slightly different, at that point, so we'll call this crit here, at that point, from there onwards, we start getting some interesting things that are occurring, and one of them is a change of state, okay? And I don't know all the words behind this, you know, but essentially from my understanding and my scientific brothers and sisters out there who have told me these things numerous times, essentially at this point we start changing the crystalline structure of the ferrite, I think. And you start basically transferring where the carbon sits. You also start developing other strange crystalline structures, I believe like perlite and cementite, and you get your carbides start forming. Anyway, with all this, we also get a little bit of a problem for us, which is an increase in grain structure. From my comprehension of this, it is the agglomeration of your perlite, cementite, and all that kind of stuff in weird clusters. So from my experience, what I have found that through temperature and time, you get agglomeration. So if you get into high temperatures, you get big chunks. Low temperatures, you get little chunks. And over this way, in the same regard, you get big chunks and whopping great big chunks, and then everything in between. So, right, sorry, my drawing's not awesome today. And then over here. If that makes any sense. So basically, if you keep just above critical temperature and you hold it for a really long time, those crystalline structures will enlarge and it become very coarse. And if you have very, very high temperatures for relatively short periods of time, they'll become very large. And likewise, if you hold it at very high temperature for really, really long times, you get monstrous grain structure. And this is a visual grain structure, and it will come out kind of like this, kind of coarse and popcorny and messy. And I'm hoping that the piece that I've had sitting in there baking away for quite some time is going to have a really nice coarse grain structure. Now, through normalization or normalizing annealing, what we hope to do by bringing it just above critical temperature, so usually about 50 degrees or so above critical, so say if we're looking at 1525, maybe bringing it up to 1600 degrees, holding it for just enough time to get all that crystalline structure into solution, or so basically dissolved, and then allowing to cool again, that grain structure will start refining. So depending upon how large you got that grain structure, depends on how many of these normalization cycles you will require. This has been baking for, what do you reckon, 30 minutes, 20 minutes, something like that. This is 01, it was a piece of 1/2 inch round bar, 4 inches long, 6 inches long. I squished it out to about 1/4 inch thick on the power hammer, and probably a little thinner than that, more like 3/16. And what I'm going to do is freak everyone out and cool off the tip in water. And I'm cooling off the tip in water because I want it to break easily. And also I don't want all that mess of the oil. Just kind of dipping it, get a nice transition of that quench line. And you know, I understand that this piece is supposed to break, and it will break, and I'm trying to show you through multiple cycles, hold on to the wretched thing, that the grain structure will reduce. So I'm going to go over this hardy hole, give it a wee tap, and hopefully it'll break. Lovely. And if you have a look at that, it is really, really coarse. Can you see that at all? And I've got the broken piece on the floor.
Yeah. Yeah.
How did Baloo's hair get on there?
Oh, Baloo's hair is everywhere.
Yeah. So you can see that it's kind of like glistening and chunky and really kind of sharded the way that it's broken. So I'm going to drop this back into the fire, reduce the fire back down a bit. And you saw how easy it was to break. I wish I had a weighted pendulum for doing break tests. What you can do is just have like a nice long pendulum with like a 1 pound weight that'll come in, strike these things and break them. Maybe one of these days I'll set it up just for the demo of this. Let that fire drop a bit more. But now what I want to do is bring it up to about 1600 degrees, hold it there, not very long at all, maybe half a minute. It's pretty thin. And then quench it again, break it again. I think this piece broke twice. So, yeah. So you can just see how coarse that structure is. Mm-hmm. Do you want it over a darker surface, or is that good?
No, I mean, I think you can see it. It's a mess.
Yeah.
Especially once it's shown against it being normalized once.
So, let's see if I can figure out how these mesh together. That-ish. I think I lost some little bits in the middle there.
There's a chunk somewhere.
Okay, so I'm going to write this one as 0. So that was kind of the tip. And number 1 break, okay? Which was that one there. I'll pop this here. And what I'm hoping that through multiple cycles, and the fire's coming down nicely, this would be great to do in a heat treat oven. That would be even slower. That little shadow is the last of the material transitioning. Give it a little bit in there, bring it in and out. I'm just going to let this now come up one more time and then cool. I let that cool to black, which isn't perfect. What I'm really supposed to do is allow it to cool fully to room temperature and then cycle it again. But hopefully we'll get a good example of grain reduction. And from tests that I've done in the past, I've found with 01, and 01 is really the only one that I've actually done it on because it does develop really, really good primary grain, as you see over there. From that long soak. And I use this as a demonstration of basically go ahead and do your normalizations. So back when we were kind of discussing this, a good friend of ours, Paul Brock, he was saying, I think he'd just gone off and taken a course with some famous sword maker or something. Anyway, he was going on about how normalization cycles were just purely a thermal cycle. And I said, well, you know, the way that I was taught about it was that you do blue-black finishing, and each time as you're coming through on your final straightening and your final hammer finishing, getting it really pretty, you would bring your temperatures gradually down, and so you start off, you know, you're probably forging in the yellow range, and then as you came down, you'd be like bright orange, the next one would be mid-orange, dull orange, you know, bright red, mid-red, cherry red, and each time you'd bring it all the way down into, just into the edge of the black zone. and I was saying, well, you know, I thought it was the hammering that refined the grain structure. And, you know, in good scientific manner, we agreed to disagree. And one day I said, all right, Paul, let's do this. And this was in the middle of a guild meeting. I said, all right, let's do this. Let's have this conversation about basically normalize annealing. So I said, I don't know. This is what I've been told. Paul said, this is what I've been told. And in so doing, we decided to do this test. And I did one piece which I'd hammer on, and the other piece was just generally thermal cycled. And I think we did 3 or 4, and then we had a test piece that just stayed in the fire for the full period of time. Well, I ate crow that day because I found out that I did not have to hammer on it, which makes my life a whole lot easier. So it is in fact just the thermal process that refines the grain structure.
You just used a word that I hear get thrown around a lot, and I think that it's another one of those terms that people aren't quite sure what it means. Thermal cycle.
Okay. So thermal cycling has become quite a fashionable term within the knife-making universe, and I'm not even sure whether it was really a thing or whether it was just one of those knife things that came about. But thermal cycling is essentially what we're doing right now, which is bringing your blade, typically, usually in a heat treat oven, up to critical temperature or above, and slowly, basically what you're doing is you're putting it into the warmth, you're heating it up, you're lifting it out, allowing it to cool to room temperature, and with every cycle you're doing a normalized cycle, which is what we are doing right here. And actually this one I'm going for a quench on, but you wouldn't do the quencher, so you just bring it up, let it cool, bring it up, let it cool.
So thermal cycling is just a fancy term for normalizing, is what you're saying?
It is the process of doing multiple cycles. Okay. So again, went for a quench, and this was quenched at a lower temperature. That should be okay. I'm trying to get shorter breaks, so I'm going to put it into a swing, which I think should do. That one don't fit in there. Maybe this one. This one's excessively long. Maybe we'll do it. There we go. Get the break at the top. Okay. So that is break number 2, and that's salt. So I won't be using that again. But you can see on break number 2, that grain structure, the break is a little weird, but the grain structure itself is finer.
Do you want to grab the first break so we can show the two together?
See how it's less shiny, it's more kind of grey.
This is
I think we're in our own light.
This is number 2.
Yeah. Okay, so hopefully with the next cycle it'll get even finer. And you know, basically I've destroyed this piece of steel by cooling it off in water each time, so just be aware of that. So that one is number 2. Take a look. Really? Oh my lord, do you have your silver pencil on you?
No.
Right, there we go. 2. And we could do this quenching into oil. The reason I'm quenching it into water is that it gives me an easier break. You saw how easy it was to break it. And what I'll eventually do is basically the same thing on a piece of steel down here and quench it in oil. that'll show you again the break difference, break strength difference of quenching between water and oil. This steel should not be quenched in water for application. Also, here's a fun one. Years ago, I had a workshop up in Ducktown, and the water was well water. Turns out that well water had a certain series of mineral deposits in it that did not work well for water quench. For even steels, I was making some springs for a lock mechanism, and it would cause them to fail. But if I used distilled water, it was great, not a problem. So the mineral content in your water on a water quench can cause you problems. Likewise, different oils make a difference, right? So, you know, you've got to understand everything about your mediums that you're going into and how they relate to your final outcome that you're trying to get. And don't assume that each batch of steel is exactly the same, right? Because if you look at the spec sheet for, you know, 01, it will say carbon content between this and this, right? Blah, 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 whatever the other alloys are. But there's a range for those alloys. That means that batch 1 and batch 50 of that same material can be different, but still be specified as 01. Generally, it doesn't vary within a sheet or within a particular run of material, but in so saying, if you get a batch of 01 and you know that 01 behaves like this, and these are the really, really hard results that you're achieving with your 01, don't assume the next batch to give you exactly the same results, because they probably won't. Right, I'm going to go for a quench. So that was normalized cycle number 2, so that is my second thermal cycle. And so I'm going to do a break test, see what it's like. Keeping my quench temperature low. I don't want to overheat my material before going to quench, which is something that I see quite a lot, especially in forge quenching, is people will get it too hot before they quench it. So, you know, you've done this beautiful normalizing, you know, you spent all that time making sure that you're just getting up to salmon orange and then allowing it to cool down. And then when you go to harden it, you go and heat the thing up to bright yellow. You've kind of undone some of the work that you've been doing. I broke in many places. I've got a double break on. And perhaps this will be better than my last one. I was hoping we weren't going to break that far apart, but so, gander. Is that finer? I can't really tell. I think I've got my greasy fingers on it.
It's hard to show in the camera, but it does seem to be, just looking at it,
A little finer.
it's a little finer, yeah.
Maybe this one will be a little clearer to tell, I don't know. It's difficult.
It is difficult to tell, but
I'll do one more.
I guess you've gotten to that point where,
It gets a little...
yeah.
But as I said in previous tests, I found that 01 generally gets to to its finest construct around 5 cycles. So I'll probably be able to get one more on this.
While that is heating up, there's do you remember that one that you did? Well, you did it during a guild meeting.
Yeah. I can go grab those.
Yeah, because those really, really show.
Oh no, they're probably a little oily with people's hands molesting them over the years.
Maybe
give
so.
It a whirl. Maybe it will show. Let me get this one into cooling.
Yeah. And who knows how much of that we'll actually be able to see on the camera.
Yeah.
People are just going to have to trust us.
But if you want to, do yourself a test. If you do a test, you'll know. One, two, three, four, and then this is number 5. So let's see if we can get 2, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, and these got kind of rusty and grotty over the years. So this is number 1. This is number 2. Number 3, number 4, and number 5. The 5th one here is almost as fine as really good slate. It's very, very fine, or maybe even kind of almost flintish in its appearance. It's kind of got a very, very smooth sheen to it. So, yeah, it kind of gives you an idea.
Hold them still, because you can see.
You can see the difference between.
Pretty well, I think, especially between, you go
from there to there.
Yeah, it's
just
it's
epic,
amazing.
And the other thing is that you'll find is that as they get harder or as they get finer in grain structure, it becomes harder to break, and especially if you're doing actual appropriate quench medium, so oil, you really, really notice it.
Yeah, which is why you chose to do water, because the last time you spent so much time trying to break it.
Yeah. So I actually had one shoot, the final one, we would have gone for one more, but that final one was so violent, it shot off like a bullet. It took us a little while to find it in the shop, and I was like, yeah, I don't need to be doing this anymore, somebody's going to get hurt. So we decided to leave it be. Last quench. So it'll break nicely for me. I can actually feel the difference. Come on now.
There it went.
Well, I was a little excited. Let's see if we can get it to break a little further down. I might not have quenched deep enough on that, but a good conversion, so we should be able to see between this piece and
It went over there by the bucket somewhere.
That's the ticket. Yeah, that's pretty good. So this is our last break, and compared to 3, does it look finer?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and this again, there's still a coarseness to it. You can get that even finer in the quench, but just through 5 cycles, and you saw how much firmer that material is and less inclined to fail. So the other interesting thing about this is people don't get it, is that all of these have just been hardened. They have not been tempered. So through tempering, you release some of that hardness, which increases the toughness. So there's kind of a toughness, hardness trade-off. So hardness often relates to brittleness, where toughness relates to how much abuse you can give it before failure. So this one being 0, as it were, and this one here being number 4, they are actually the same hardness. And it being 01, I know it's above 65. So I'm actually getting no cut on that, and I should get no cut on this one as well. Yeah, no cut. But the difference being is that the one with the coarse grain structure is hugely more fragile than the one with the fine grain structure. Long and short of it is, if you don't do good normalized cycles or good normalizing anneals to bring your grain structure down, your tool, knife, whatever it might be, will not be at the best of its capabilities. And the idea is always to produce a product which has the best capabilities you can possibly give it. So learn your steel, learn what it does for you. If you're forging a blade and you find that steel X requires 3 normalization cycles in order to bring it down to the finest grain structure that you can get it to, give it those 3 normalized cycles. And if you find that you get better results by doing those cycles in a heat treat oven, do them in a heat treat oven, because you're going to get better results. And at the end of the day, it does not affect the hardness, it merely affects the toughness. And toughness often is what we're trying to gain, even if the hardness is high. Okay? So, do you think I covered everything there, Jess?
I think so, yes.
Okay.
I think you answered a lot of questions. And if people have questions, ask. Yeah, send us a message and ask the question.
Also, if you have questions, test.
That's another one, yeah.
Do test, understand what it does for you. Like, I'm not going to shut down at that point. I would like to do one last thing. Like, stick that back in the fire and enlarge the grain structure on it, right? So basically undo everything like that, which, this is probably going to be one of those things that Jess cuts in post, because I'm probably going to want to soak it for about 10 minutes. But the fact of the matter is that you can undo all your hard work with a very, very flippant decision. So you go stick your blade in the heat treat, or into the forge, certainly. In your heat treat oven, you have less issues with that. But then you walk away, you go have a cup of tea, the phone rings, the dog decides it wants to play with the ball or whatever, and then you go, oh crap, I haven't quenched my blade. You whip your blade out, you quench it, and your grain structure's gone to hell.
But I normalized it.
You undid all your hard work. So, just understand what you're actually doing. There's far more to this game than just following it by rote. Understand what is going on. And by understanding, it might be just that. You don't need to know all the fancy words. How many times, people are like, well, that's such and such, and this is so and so. I don't care. I don't care what it's called. Do you think the sword makers 500 years ago knew what the words were? They knew that if they did this thing in this particular manner, they would get these results. Awesome. And they did it. And it doesn't matter that they didn't know that on a microscopic scale, such and such was occurring. So understand it as an intellectual pursuit of what is actually occurring, a scientific manner. But again, it doesn't make any difference what the actual terminology is, you know. Otherwise, it would be still going around finding virgins to plunge our daggers into to make it hard.
And on that note, I'm gonna cut it here and come back once that's hot.
Yay! I can see that thing in there right now.
Okay.
That piece of metal has been soaking in for like 15 or 20 minutes, so I'm going to lift it out, and if I can find the wretched thing, might not be anything left with it. There, lift it out. This thing has cooked.
Woo, boy, look at that.
Let that cool down. It's got a little bit of oxide built up on it. Oh, can you smell that? It's almost sulfurous. It's pretty good. Probably could have forge welded that if I fluxed it up. So I'm going to let that cool down and then bring it back one more time and do a brake test on it, quench it, do a brake test on it. And we should have a good fat grain structure again. The reason I'm cooling it down is to show that it's not the quench at high temperature that causes the large grain, but instead it's the actual time of it sitting in the fire that develops the large grain. Safe glasses down and all one of them in the eyeball. It's a little bit of fun. Look at that oxide build up, it's pretty amazing.
That is nasty.
Yeah. And that oxide was downright sticky when I pulled it out, so it's almost liquid. Beautiful plastic state. Alright, that's probably good enough. I'm going to pop it in, bring it up to temp for quenching. Just let that soak a little. That fire was truly hot. Do it. One more break. Hopefully this won't go horribly sideways. Oh yeah, that broke so easily. And there we go. Look at that. God, that's almost worse than it was before. So it's back to how number one was.
Oh yeah, it's maybe worse.
Yeah, so sparkly. And to show that I am not making all of this up, that is the tail end of the break of that one. Albeit a little bit kind of oxidized away, but there you go. So there's a little bit of knowledge, I suppose, a little bit of the thought process. It's worthwhile doing some brake tests on your steel, understanding it a little bit, seeing how many cycles it does take you to bring those that grain structure down. Also, when you're doing hammer finishing, just take a knife or whatever you make through the cycles that you normally would in the forging process, bringing it down to final thickness, doing your hammer finish if you do hammer finish, and then try destroying it. Heat it up, quench it, break it, have a look at that grain structure. Then do a normalized cycle on it, break it, have a look at that grain structure, and see what it takes to bring it down. Because it's worthwhile knowing. Because if you know what is required, then you can do what is required. That's really all it is. Make the best thing that you can. That steel has waited in the earth for millennia. It's been drugged from the stars, brought to us here, waited for us to do something with it, so give it its best. All right? That's my thought anyway. Yay.